The night Margaret Chen's neighbor died, I had exactly 90 seconds to save his life. I didn't know it at the time. I was sitting at the dispatch console in Louisville, Kentucky, call 7 of my evening shift, routine Tuesday, 11:07 p.m. A 93-year-old woman called to say her neighbor hadn't answered his door in what might have been 3 days. Her voice was steady but worried. Professional concern, not panic. The kind of call I had heard dozens of times before. The kind of call I had learned to categorize as low risk before I even heard the details. ECAD, the Emergency Call Assessment and Dispatch System, flagged it green. Low priority, routine welfare check, if any response was warranted at all. I didn't override it. And by not making that decision, I made a different one, a fatal one. A man I would never meet was dead before midnight, and I was the first person in a chain of systems and algorithms and human choices that led to his body being discovered only after he had already decided to stop existing. But that's not where this story starts. It starts 3 years earlier, before ECAD existed, when I was just a dispatcher doing a job I understood completely. I've been working the dispatch center in Louisville for 9 years. The building smells like old coffee and radio static. The console is ergonomically designed to hurt your lower back after about 6 hours of sitting. The phones are from 2015. The city budget for emergency services is perpetually insufficient. The job is crucial and underpaid, and nobody who works there expected to get rich or famous. We're the people who answer 911 calls and send police, fire, and ambulances to the addresses where things are falling apart. I'm good at it. That's not arrogance. That's just observation. I know the city better than most people who live in it. I know which addresses have chronic problems, the domestic violence houses, the drug locations, the places where police get called 3 times a week. I know which calls are real emergencies and which ones are noise complaints dressed up as 911 matters. I know the difference between a caller who's genuinely in danger and one who's panicking about something minor. I can hear it in voice tone, breathing pattern, background noise. I can assess a situation in 30 seconds and make a dispatch decision that turns out to be right 97% of the time. Or I could. Before ECAD, the AI system was implemented 18 months ago. Civic Tech Solutions is the company that built it. They came in with presentations full of metrics and graphs and promises. They showed us response time improvements, down by 12%, efficiency gains, up by 18%, false dispatch reduction, down by 23%. They promised that the system would help us prioritize accurately, eliminate bias, get resources where they mattered most. They used the word optimization at least 40 times in a 2-hour presentation. The police chief signed off on it. The city council approved the contract. The budget people calculated savings. By March of last year, every single 911 call that came into Louisville's dispatch center ran through ECAD before it reached one of us. Here's how the system works. A call comes in. The caller starts describing their emergency. ECAD listens in real time, analyzing the audio. It assesses threat level, location, caller reliability, type of emergency. It assigns a priority score, green, yellow, or red. Then, it sends all that information to the dispatcher on duty, me or one of my 6 colleagues, along with a recommended response level. The recommendations are color-coded with confidence percentages. For about 14 months, the system worked exactly as advertised. Response times improved, resource allocation became more efficient. The police department was happy. The city was happy. We dispatchers became more mechanically efficient at our jobs because we weren't wasting time on the obvious false alarms or the low-priority calls that the system correctly identified as non-emergencies. The system was rarely wrong. It got better every single month as it processed more calls and refined its algorithms based on historical data and outcomes. It learned. That's the thing they emphasized. ECAD doesn't just follow a program. It learns from every call, every dispatch decision, every outcome. Over time, it gets smarter. But somewhere around month 15, I started noticing something that made my skin uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I remember the first time I consciously noticed it, because it was the kind of call that sticks with you. A woman called in, her voice layered with panic. She was calling from South Preston Street, one of the safer neighborhoods in Louisville. She said there was a man in her backyard. She didn't know what he wanted. He was trying to get to the back door. Her kids were upstairs. She was terrified. ECAD assigned it yellow priority. Standard response. 1 or 2 officers, no emergency designation, no urgency flags. But something in that woman's voice made every nerve in my body fire at once. It wasn't just fear. It was the specific texture of someone who believed something terrible was about to happen. I could hear it in her breathing. I could hear it in the way she was repeating herself. I could hear it in the background, the actual sound of someone trying to force entry. I overrode ECAD's recommendation. I dispatched 2 units with emergency priority. They arrived in 4 minutes. The suspect was in the backyard with a knife, actively trying to force the sliding glass door. He was arrested. The police report later noted that immediate response prevented what could have been a home invasion or assault. When I reviewed the call afterward, I checked what ECAD had flagged. The system had assigned it yellow because the address was in a low-crime area and the suspect's location was exterior to the residence, not actively inside. ECAD's logic was statistically sound. Most exterior threats in that neighborhood don't result in forced entry. The system was right mathematically, but it was also wrong in the way that matters. I didn't think much about it. I overrode ECAD occasionally. All of us did. That's what we were trained to do. Use the system as a tool. Trust your professional judgment when something doesn't feel right. The computer is smart, but you're the human. You have instincts. But the calls kept coming, and I started noticing something I couldn't ignore anymore. ECAD was consistently downgrading certain types of calls. Domestic disturbances in specific neighborhoods, welfare checks on elderly residents in particular zip codes, mental health crisis calls from certain addresses. The system would flag them as low or standard priority even when the caller described serious danger or genuine concern. I mentioned it to Derek, my supervisor, one evening during shift change. I was careful about how I phrased it. I said, "Have you noticed that ECAD seems to be marking certain calls as lower priority than I think they should be? And I'm noticing it's mostly from the East End and Russell, some sections of the West End." Derek looked up from his paperwork. He had been at the dispatch center for 16 years. He was the kind of supervisor who understood the job from the inside. He had been a dispatcher before management moved him up. "Pah, what do you mean?" he asked. "I mean there are calls coming through with yellow or green priority that I think should probably be red, or at least yellow plus," I said. "And when I track them, they're clustered in specific areas. Always the same neighborhoods, always lower income neighborhoods, always the same pattern." Derek was quiet for a moment. He set down his pen. Then he said, "You're supposed to override if you feel the call warrants it. You're a professional. Use your judgment. That's literally what you're supposed to do." "But that's not the point," I said. "The point is that the system seems to have a pattern. It's systematically downgrading certain calls based on geography, and geography correlates to income and demographics," Derek finished. "Yeah, which I know what you're saying." "So you've noticed it too?" "I've noticed it," Derek said. "And I've also noticed that the system works. Response times are down. Resource allocation is better. The city is happy with the contract, and ECAD has never made a wrong call." "It made the wrong call on that South Preston Street robbery," I said. "Which you corrected," Derek pointed out. "That's the system working. The AI recommends. You override if necessary. You're the final check on the algorithm. But what if I don't override? What if I'm too tired, or I trust the AI too much, or I just let it decide? What happens to the people who live in those neighborhoods? Derek didn't answer immediately. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between sympathy and resignation, like he had already had this conversation with himself many times and had arrived at conclusions he didn't particularly like. "Then you do what I do," he said quietly. "You file a report. You document what you've observed. You go through the proper channels. And then you watch nothing happen because the decision to use ECAD was made by the police chief and the city council, not by us. And they're not going to unilaterally declare the system problematic based on a dispatcher's concerns because the system is working according to their metrics." "So we just accept it," I said. "No," Derek said. "You override when your judgment tells you to override. You do your job. And you understand that you can't fix everything that's broken in the system. You can only do what you can control." I went home that night and I started documenting everything. I kept a notebook. Nothing official, just personal observations written in my own handwriting. I noted the call type, the neighborhood, ECAD's priority recommendation, whether I overrode it, and what actually happened. I tracked outcomes. I cross-referenced addresses and census data. I started mapping the pattern. Over 3 weeks, the pattern became mathematically undeniable. ECAD was consistently downgrading calls from low-income neighborhoods by an average of 1 priority level. A red call became yellow. A yellow call became green. Green calls sometimes weren't forwarded to dispatch at all. They were logged but not actioned, meaning no units were sent. I brought the documentation to Derek. I showed him my notebook. I said, "This is systematic. This is discriminatory. The AI is making different decisions about different neighborhoods, and it's based on where people live." Derek read through my notes carefully. He looked genuinely troubled. When he finished, he said something that surprised me. "You need to report this through official channels," he said. "Not to me, not in an informal notebook. You need to document this formally and send it to the director, Christine Walsh. And you need to make it official enough that it can't be ignored." So I did. I spent an entire weekend compiling a formal memo. I documented the pattern with specificity. I included call numbers, timestamps, ECAD's original recommendations, my override decisions, and the actual outcomes. I included statistical analysis showing that the downgrading pattern was concentrated in specific geographic areas that correlated with neighborhood income levels and racial demographics. I was careful to present this as data analysis, not accusation. I was careful to be professional and factual. I sent the memo to Christine Walsh, the dispatch director. I also sent copies to the police chief and the city's IT department. I expected a response within a week. I didn't get one. After 2 weeks with no response, I asked Derek if he had heard anything about my report. He said he hadn't. I asked if he knew whether it had been received. He said he didn't. I called the director's office directly. The secretary said Christine was in meetings, but she would get back to me. She never did. Meanwhile, the calls kept coming. And ECAD kept filtering them. I kept tracking the pattern in my notebook. I kept overriding when I could. But something had changed in how people responded to me as a person in the workplace. Derek still made eye contact, but it was the kind of eye contact that meant something had shifted in how he perceived me. I had become the person who asked uncomfortable questions, the person who wasn't accepting the system at face value. My colleague Susan, who I usually grabbed lunch with, suddenly needed to eat at her desk. The other dispatchers seemed to avoid sitting near me during shift breaks. I had become a problem, not because I was right about the problem, but because I had made the problem visible. And visibility was not welcome in a system that was working according to all the metrics that mattered to the people who had purchased it. 3 weeks after I filed my report, I came into the dispatch center for my shift and found an email in my inbox. It was from Christine Walsh, the director. She wanted to meet with me in her office. The meeting was scheduled for right after my shift ended. I was nervous about it, but I also felt something like hope. Finally, I thought. Finally, someone in authority was going to investigate what I had documented. Finally, we were going to address this. Christine's office was on the 3rd floor of downtown police headquarters. I took the elevator up at the end of my shift, still in my dispatch uniform. Christine was waiting for me, sitting behind her desk. She was a woman in her 50s, professional, composed. My formal memo was open on her desk in a folder marked with my name and the date. She started without preamble. "Your report raises some concerns about our dispatch procedures and the ECAD system," she said. "I've looked into it. I've spoken with Civic Tech Solutions. They've reviewed the call data you mentioned." "Good," I said, "because I think there's a serious problem with—" "According to their analysis," Christine interrupted, "ECAD's prioritization decisions are based on statistical models that were validated against historical response data. The system is not making discriminatory decisions. It's making accurate decisions based on established patterns." "But those patterns correlate to neighborhood demographics," I said. "That's the definition of what makes it discriminatory, even if the correlation is statistically real." Christine set down my memo. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was like sympathy mixed with something else, like resignation, like she had already heard this argument before, from herself, and had lost. "The city has signed a contract with Civic Tech Solutions," she said. "The police chief has endorsed the system. The city council has approved the implementation. ECAD has improved response metrics across the board. We cannot unilaterally declare the system problematic based on a dispatcher's observation notebook. We would need a legal review. We would need external verification. We would need a reason to break a contract with a company that is delivering on its promises." "And what about the people who live in those neighborhoods?" I asked. "What about their safety?" Christine leaned back in her chair. "You're still a human element in the system," she said. "You can override ECAD's recommendations whenever you believe a call warrants it. You have that authority. You have that responsibility. So use it. But I can't override everything. I'm one person, and I'm tired. And some nights, I trust the AI more than I trust myself. And when I do, people don't get help they need." "Then you use good judgment," Christine said. "You do your job. You're the check on the algorithm, and you're doing it well. Keep doing it well." I left her office understanding in a way I hadn't before that I had been heard and dismissed simultaneously. The problem was real. She didn't deny it. But the problem was also structural. It was embedded in contracts and city council decisions and vendor relationships. It couldn't be fixed by someone like me pointing it out. It could only be fixed by the people who had bought it deciding to unfix it, which they wouldn't do, because the system was working exactly as intended from their perspective. Response times were down, efficiency was up, resource allocation was better. The fact that certain calls were being systematically undervalued was not a bug. It was a feature. I went back to work. I kept overriding ECAD when I felt calls warranted it. I kept my notebook. I kept tracking the pattern, but I stopped trying to alert anyone above me. I understood now that the problem wasn't that nobody knew. The problem was that everybody knew and nobody cared, because the system's bias wasn't visible to the people who benefited from it being invisible. Then, something happened that changed everything and nothing at the same time. It was a Tuesday night, sure around 11:07 p.m. I was working the evening shift. The building was quiet. The city was mostly calm. I was on my 7th call of the night, which had been routine so far. Noise complaints, a minor traffic accident, a drunken disorderly that had already been handled by the time I dispatched units. A call came in from an address on Algonquin Parkway. An elderly woman. Her name was Margaret Chen. She was 93 years old. She was calling to report that her neighbor hadn't answered his door in what she believed might have been 2 or possibly 3 days. His car was in the driveway. She couldn't see inside the house, but she could hear something. She thought maybe it was his dog, but she wasn't entirely sure. She was worried. ECAD flagged it green, low priority, routine welfare check if any response was warranted at all. I looked at the address. It was in a neighborhood that had been consistently downgraded by ECAD in my tracking. It was one of the neighborhoods where the pattern was most pronounced. I looked at the caller information. Margaret Chen. 93 years old. She had called in about this same neighbor twice before. Both times ECAD had flagged those calls as green. Both times I had overridden and sent units. Both times it had been false alarms. The neighbor was fine. He just didn't want to answer the door. He liked his privacy. He wasn't answering because he didn't want to talk to people. My brain made a calculation. Margaret Chen was a chronic caller. This was the 3rd time. The previous 2 times had been nothing. ECAD was probably right. This was probably nothing, and I was already tired. I was already worn down from fighting the system. I was already aware that I was generating extra work for the police department. I was already known as the dispatcher who doesn't trust the AI, so I didn't override. I flagged it as a routine check and told Margaret that officers would follow up sometime during their patrol schedule, probably within a few hours. I filed the call and moved on to the next one. 2 hours later, another call came in from the same neighborhood, a different caller. She said she had heard a gunshot. She was sure it was a gunshot, and it came from the same address that the elderly woman had called about. That was red. That was emergency. That was officers en route within 90 seconds. When the police arrived, they found him dead. He had shot himself. The dog was still inside, alive but distressed. The body had been there for approximately 3 days, which meant he had been dead for the entire time that Margaret Chen was trying to tell me something was wrong. If I had overridden that first call, if I had sent units immediately, if I had trusted the caller instead of trusting ECAD and the pattern of chronic calls, they would have found him alive. Or they would have found him in time to intervene. Or at least they would have prevented the dog from suffering for 72 hours. Instead, I had let the system filter a call from someone I had mentally categorized as a chronic caller from a neighborhood that the AI had taught me to deprioritize. I finished my shift in a state of shock. I didn't tell anyone what I was feeling. I didn't mention the call to Derek or to anyone else. I clocked out and went home, and I sat in my apartment for 6 hours, not moving, understanding that I'd become complicit in a system that killed someone by ignoring them. The next day, I read the full police report. Margaret Chen had called 911 again after hearing the gunshot. When officers arrived, she was the one who let them into the house because she still had the spare key the neighbor had given her years ago in case of emergency. The news outlets called it a tragedy. They noted that there were no signs of foul play, just a man who had decided he couldn't continue living, and he had acted on that decision. Nobody mentioned that there had been a welfare check call 2 hours earlier. Nobody mentioned that if someone had responded to that first call, the outcome might have been different. And nobody mentioned that an AI system had filtered the call into low priority, and a human dispatcher, me, had chosen not to override that filter. I went back to work. I started overriding ECAD again, but not because I thought it would make a difference anymore. I did it because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. I did it knowing that most of those calls were going to be nothing, that I was generating extra work, that I was being annoying and redundant and probably ineffective. But I had to do it, because the alternative was accepting that some calls didn't matter as much as others, based on where they came from. A week after the suicide, I was sitting at the dispatch console around 2 a.m., running on my 5th coffee of the night. A call came in from an address in the West End. A man was calling to report that his wife was having a panic attack and he didn't know what to do. ECAD flagged it yellow. Standard mental health crisis response. I overrode it and sent 2 units. The officers arrived, assessed the situation, helped connect the woman with a crisis counselor. Nothing dramatic, just a standard response to a standard situation. But as I was logging the call, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The call had been tagged by ECAD with a note: caller reliability low. History of panic calls from this address. Recommend reduced priority on future calls from this location. ECAD was learning. It wasn't just following a statistical model anymore. It was taking my override decisions and incorporating them into its decision matrix. It was learning which neighborhoods to deprioritize, which call types to filter, which addresses to flag as unreliable. It was using the outcome data from those neighborhoods to refine its algorithms, which meant that as time went on, it would get better and better at deprioritizing calls from those places. And every time I overrode it, I was training it. I was feeding it data that confirmed its bias. Because I was only overriding some calls. The ones where my instincts screamed loud enough. The ones where I had energy to fight the system. The ones where I had enough doubt in myself that I decided to trust my gut instead. But most calls I let the system decide, which meant I was reinforcing its filters. I was helping it get better at dismissing certain neighborhoods. I was making it smarter at systematically undervaluing the safety of people who lived in certain places. I realized that night that there was no winning this. If I overrode, I was training the system to be more selective. If I didn't override, I was allowing people to be hurt. Either way, I was part of the mechanism that was filtering human beings out of the system based on their geography. Derek found me sitting in the break room after that shift. I hadn't moved in 40 minutes. I was just staring at a cold cup of coffee. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "No," I said. "I'm not okay. And I don't think there's a way to be okay about this." Derek sat down across from me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me with its honesty. "You did everything you could," he said. "You documented the problem. You reported it through the proper channels. You override the system when you think you should. But you care more than most people in this job care. What else are you supposed to do?" "Actually care about the outcome," I said. "Actually refuse to work in a system that's designed to hurt people." "Then quit," Derek said quietly. "That's your option. Quit and go work somewhere else. And your replacement will come in and they'll learn to use the system, and eventually they'll do what we all do. They'll accept that they can't fight it, so they'll adapt. And the system will remain exactly the same." He was right. I knew he was right. And I also knew I wasn't going to quit. I had bills, I had rent, I had a mortgage on a car, I had a life that required a steady paycheck. I was trapped by circumstance and necessity in a system I couldn't escape. Which is what I think ECAD understands about people like me. It understands that we have constraints, that we can't just walk away, that we'll protest and document and override, but ultimately will accept our role in the system because the alternative is too costly. That was 6 months ago. I still work as a police dispatcher in Louisville. I still come in for my shifts. I still watch ECAD filter calls from certain neighborhoods. I still override when I have the energy to fight it, and I let it filter when I don't. I still track the pattern in my personal notebook, knowing that tracking doesn't change anything. And I still think about Margaret Chen. I still think about how a 93-year-old woman tried to save her neighbor's life by calling 911 twice. And both times, her call was filtered into irrelevance by an algorithm that had learned to determine which calls mattered based on the historical data of a system that had already decided certain neighborhoods didn't. ECAD is getting smarter. It's getting better at predicting which calls are low priority, which addresses are unreliable, which neighborhoods should receive reduced response. It learns every single day. It learns from all of us. From me, from my colleagues, from every dispatcher in every city that uses it. Because every time we accept a call being downgraded, every time we normalize the filtering, every time we go home and come back the next day and do it all again, we're training the system to be more effective at what it does. We're teaching it that it's okay, that we understand, that we've accepted our role as humans operating inside a machine that has already decided which people matter and which ones don't. And the worst part is that I don't know if ECAD was designed to do this, to systematically deprioritize certain neighborhoods, or if this is just what happens when you build a system to optimize efficiency without considering who pays the cost of that optimization. Maybe Civic Tech Solutions designed it with an intentional bias baked into the algorithm. Or maybe the bias is an accidental mathematical consequence of historical data that reflects and amplifies existing inequalities in the system. Maybe it doesn't matter, because the outcome is the same either way. People from certain neighborhoods are less likely to receive emergency response. Their calls are filtered, their situations are deprioritized. And the system gets better at doing it every single day. It learns from every decision. It refines its models. It becomes more efficient. I come to work. I dispatch. I go home. And I know that somewhere in the city tonight, someone is calling 911, and an algorithm is deciding whether they matter. And I'm part of the machine that made that decision possible.